No.
Hello.
Am I trying to?
Keep eating, stop talking.
It's easier.
Thank you. Don't clap for me. I'm no hero. Welcome to today's lunch and lecture series. I'd like to point this out now before I forget. Thursday we're doing a talk on the national security leaks, so definitely come to that as well. Today we're going to talk about the Transportation Security Administration and your privacy. We figured this would be timely as many of you, well, a lot of you are 1Ls, so you're probably not actually heading home for fall break. But those of you who are fortunate enough to will get to experience the TSA. To talk about that with us today, we have Mr. Stewart Verdery, who is the founder and partner at the Monument Policy Group. I have no idea what they do. I'm sure he can tell us. He's also served as general counsel to Senator Don Nichols and counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Orrin Hatch. And he also served as the first assistant secretary for policy and planning at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He was unanimously confirmed by the Senate, and at DHS's Border and Transportation Security Directorate, he led efforts to develop and implement policies related to immigration, visas, travel facilitation, cargo security, international trade, transportation security, and law enforcement. I'm guessing he knows what he's talking about. Ms. Sarah Preston joins us from the ACLU of North Carolina. She has been the policy director there since 2006. I'd have much more to share, but Google searches turn up much less on her. Thank you to the Duke Law ACLU chapter for co-sponsoring today's event, and I hope you enjoy it. Mr. Verdery, you can lead us off.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having us. I usually think that if you're handing out lunch and cupcakes, it's a good draw when the weather's this crappy outside. So it's nice you spend some time here, as opposed to I saw you have 1,000 events going today. It's impressive. So congratulations. And I guess it's not quite time to get ready to get in line for Duke basketball tickets yet. Not quite yet. Already done. Okay. Good stuff. The last time I was here was actually 2005. When I was at Homeland Security, I worked a lot on visa issues, and that's a big deal for many schools, especially higher kind of the graduate programs who are having people come into for study, and they were having trouble getting visas because of all the post 9/11 restrictions. And your president, I guess, heard me speak, or one of his people saw me speak, and sent me a letter and said, "Welcome to have you come down here and talk about visas." And so I told my assistant, I said, "I'll be happy to go down as long as you can get me 2 front row tickets to the next Duke game," which they were happy to do. And got to watch them in action. Unfortunately, I had to pay for them, but good stuff. But now it's interesting. One of the most fun days of my life was after about 6 months after I left Homeland Security, when I no longer felt like I had to defend everything the TSA was doing, because that's really a tough task. It's been a interesting agency. I was actually up in Congress working in the Senate leadership before 9/11, and actually on 9/11. And the sad tale for that day was the woman who actually had my job before me, working for the Senate Majority Leader Don Nichols, was on the plane that hit the Pentagon. And she had called her husband, Ted Olson, who at the time was the Solicitor General of the United States, from midair, and had heard from other passengers what had happened. And she'd actually ID'd the terrorists on the plane while they were still flying, and gotten that to Ted, who had gotten that to my boss, who had gotten that to the FBI, all before the plane actually hit the building, unfortunately. And so it was a little bit personal for us, some of the things that happened after that. And one of the bills I worked on was the one that set up the TSA, the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, ATSA. It was interesting because at the time, there was a big push to federalize security, and that was largely based on screw-ups, not only 9/11, but before they've been identified. And there was a big debate whether to federalize the workforce. And my boss was actually one of the few that was pushing back against this, saying, look, once you create this thing with federal employees, and it'll kind of become a beast of its own in terms of budget and authorities and ever-ending responsibilities. And I think there's been a little bit of truth to that. But nonetheless, his view lost, and you ended up with this massive new agency with very tight timeframes to go take over aviation security. The best funny line out of that whole deal, Senator Cleland from Georgia, who was working on it and was for the bill, his main argument was like, look, the people who were working security before 9/11, working at Cinnabon would be a promotion. And that was kind of the problem, was you had these kind of low scale people who had washed out of private security in many cases, couldn't make it as police officers or in the military, or even private contractors were working as the aviation security. And while I don't think most people blame 9/11 for that, there was a sense that this was not a professionalized workforce, and so we decided to turn them all into a federal workforce. So after passing the bill, then typical in Washington, I went over and helped run the thing for 2 years when Tom Ridge was secretary and was responsible for overseeing policy at TSA. And that was a tough time. One, because you were getting a startup off the ground. Two, Congress had really micromanaged exactly what they're supposed to do in terms of how they screen bags, how they screen passengers, all those types of things. And three, it was a time when the media attention on TSA was just relentless. Every time there was a screw up, every time somebody snuck a knife past security, or somebody, a red team thing found that they weren't screening people properly, or they missed a deadline, it was on the front page news, not only like USA Today, where it's still on the front page of the news, but New York Times, Washington Post, and the like. And everybody was kind of the one-upsmanship in terms of Congress doing oversight, hearings, and this kind of thing. So it was a very tough time for TSA. The good news is I think that as time has gone on, they've managed to recalibrate expectations a little bit, so they now are judged a little more fairly in what they reasonably should be able to accomplish. From a macro perspective, I'd say TSA is probably the biggest experiment we've had since 9/11 is how much are we willing to pay for security? And that is not only budgetary cost, and TSA is an expensive endeavor now, about $8 billion. By way of comparison, it's only slightly less expensive than the FBI, which does a lot of things, law enforcement and otherwise. And TSA does one thing, and perhaps not that great sometimes. It also has had a big cost on privacy, as I'm sure my colleague will talk about, in terms of not only personal privacy when you travel, but also watch lists and those kinds of things that have had a real impact on, I'd say a small number of people, but a meaningful number of people. And then the third thing, it's had a real economic impact. In my current job, Monument Policy Group, go on the website. If you need a lobbyist in Washington, I highly recommend us. We represented a lot of different types of companies, technology companies and corporations and associations, but we've done a lot of work in the aviation space, including representing airports and vendors who sell into the market and make security equipment and those kinds of things, and also representing the travel industry writ large, which is the Disneys and Carnivals and Las Vegases of the world who care about moving people in the United States and then around the United States. And they've done a number of studies, economic studies, that have shown this is TSA and the whole kind of airport hassle has had a major impact on people's willingness to fly. And in some cases, they're taking alternative modes, driving, those kinds of things. But in many cases, they're just refusing to do it. It's not worth taking an hour-and-a-half flight when it takes you an hour-and-a-half to get through security. And that has come at the same time as you've seen growth in video conferencing and other types of alternative ways for people to meet or to do business. But it's very daunting, especially if you guys are too young, in most cases, I'm guessing, to have kids. But traveling with young kids through TSA is not much fun. And so, it has had a big impact on the economic side, not to mention the privacy and the budgetary costs. The interesting thing, though, I think, is it's almost impossible for TSA to be measured. How do you measure TSA whether they're doing a good job or not? Has there been a terrorist attack? Okay, well, under that measure, they've done pretty well. There hasn't been a terrorist attack in the United States involving aviation since 9/11. Is it based on how many things they seize, knives, guns, and those kinds of things? If so, that's kind of a dumb metric, because most people who bring a knife or a gun accidentally in their bag are not terrorists. They just have packed poorly or forgotten about something. And is that really what we want people looking for? There was a big debate when I was at DHS whether they should be looking for matches. This was after the Richard Reed shoe bomber incident. And obviously having matches on a plane in the hands of somebody who's nefarious is not a good thing. The problem is, if you tell a TSA inspector that you should be going to look for matches in people's carry-on luggage, they're now looking for something that does not show up on an x-ray. And so they are now sniffing through bags, looking for something that by itself is not a threat, and is very easy to hide, but also people carry a lot of. And so it ended up being this huge distraction from things that are much more dangerous, explosives, for instance. And finally, Congress was willing to scale that back, but it took a number of years and a number of studies to make sure that people were kind of realized that that was not what they should be looking for. The other thing I thought was interesting is, TSA gets the blame for why people don't like security, but in many cases, it's only part of the situation. They don't control the part of the process until you get up to the magnetometers or other equipment. Airlines control everything in front of that, and that's why you see the growth of these first-class lines, these queuing techniques that are meant really to get more money out of your pockets, to pay for a speedier process at the airport. Airlines have essentially commoditized the security process. And so that is a huge problem. I worked on a blue ribbon panel last year that Tom Ridge chaired, and a former Democratic congressman from Texas, Jim Turner, who had run the Homeland Security Committee. And one of the recommendations we had was that, and this may seem counterintuitive, but that TSA should take over the entire security process, which they currently do not. And they would have a better chance of maximizing the screening process in a way that would move people through more quickly, and not say we're going to have a first-class line. You may be just as risky as the next person, but if you pay $1,000 for a first-class ticket, or if you fly a lot with a particular airline, you get a speedy process, and the rest of us are stuck over here in a longer line. Airlines, of course, have resisted that. Now, the good news is, I think, especially in the last 3 years, there have been some major improvements at TSA, and part of that is Congress somewhat scaling back their expectations, less micromanagement over the process. There have been, a number of improvements, especially on how we deal with international travelers, and not all of this is TSA's responsibility. They work hand in hand, of course, with intelligence agencies, with the State Department, with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. But the things that the 9/11 Commission found that were wanting on 9/11 in terms of watch lists and those kinds of reviews have really been improved. Visa applicants are now screened much more thoroughly and fingerprinted. The watch list process is much more robust with some downsides, but people do not fall through the cracks as much between agencies talking to each other. When I was at DHS, we built a program called U.S. Visit, which is the friendly word for you're going to get fingerprinted when you come into the United States. And it was a high risk program. This is the biggest fingerprint database that had ever been created by the U.S. government. And it was, when we turned the thing on, I remember January 5th, 2004, it was literally turning on Skynet. Is this thing going to work or not? And it did. And we built up a database, 500,000, 1 million, 2 million, 10 million. The database now has over 200 million sets of fingerprints, all foreign guests. And it is checked every day. It takes about 6 seconds to run somebody's fingerprints against the database to see if that fingerprint has shown up in a cave in Afghanistan or shown up in a FBI database. And most travelers don't like it, but they've gotten used to it, and it has worked at a relatively low cost point. The Secure Flight Program, if you've flown lately, you have to put in your date of birth and full name and gender, has done a good job at essentially distinguishing people enough so that less people are caught up in a watch list check. Not perfect, but now if you're Andrew Jones, they can tell that you're Andrew Jones, the 50-year-old man from Chicago, and not Andrea Jones, the woman from San Francisco who's 21. And that's had some good impact on terms of less people being inconvenienced. And then probably the most notable thing, and I found this out firsthand yesterday when I flew down here, have any of you all gone through what's called the PreCheck program? Okay. Well, PreCheck is the program TSA launched last year. It's a risk-based screening. It basically says if you fall into one of two categories, you are going to get an easier process at the airport. You can walk through without taking off your jacket, without taking out your liquids, without taking out your laptop, without taking off your shoes. And you can get into this category either by interviewing with Customs and Border Protection and doing an interview and a fingerprint check and paying $100 for 5 years. And that is good not only for TSA, but also when you return to the country, you can skip the immigration lines and go to a kiosk. It's a great deal if you fly internationally, really, at all. Or you can get sponsored by your airline. If you happen to fly a lot on a particular airline, you're like Uber Platinum, they will put you in as well. It's not quite as good because it only works for that particular airline and the airports that they happen to service, but it's better than nothing. So yesterday, I got into Global Entry, the customs program, a couple years ago. And yesterday I got to Reagan. There was about a 20-minute line to fly down here. The PreCheck line was about as there was no one in it because it's not well used enough yet. And I literally didn't stop moving the entire time. I pulled my ID out, my boarding pass, I hand it to the person. They put it on the scanner, identifies me as PreCheck. I walk through, I dump my bags on the belt. Nothing comes off, goes to the belt. I'm walking as fast as the bag is moving. I pick them up on the other side. It was 41 seconds from start to finish. And that's all because I took the time a couple years ago to get interviewed and go through this process. And there was an article actually in the New York Times today about the small number of people who get rejected by the program. If you've got a criminal record or had a prior run-in with customs, you're probably not going to make it. But that's about 98% of you would be able to qualify without any trouble. So I recommend it to you if you travel at all. The last thing I'd say before turning it over is, and I think, again, I really admire groups, and the TSA issue in particular has been kind of one of those left-right issues where groups on the left, as well as kind of civil libertarians groups on the right, have really raised eyebrows about TSA's practices, whether it's body scanners or watch lists or the SPOT program, which looks for suspicious behavior at airports. Rand Paul, who's probably one of the more famous conservative Republicans in Congress, has been the number one agitator against TSA in Congress. I admire the fact that they keep the pressure on TSA because you want good oversight of an agency that costs $8 billion and has 65,000 people. But I will say that the research that we've seen is that most people are most concerned not about privacy so much, but about efficiency. They want to know, can I get to the airport and get through there? If I've got a disability, if I've got a medical condition, if I've got kids in particular, or I'm a business person and I've got to make that flight to make a deal, I want to know I don't have to show up 4 hours ahead of time. So they want to know it's going to be efficient, and they want to know that it's effective, that all this money that's being spent, all this effort is actually working. And that's the tough part, is showing the metrics. So I'd give TSA over, its now 10-year history or so, maybe a C plus altogether, but kind of improving. So, wouldn't be very good for y'all's grades, I'm guessing. But maybe C plus and getting better. An interesting tidbit will be we had a lot of turnover with TSA the first 7 or 8 years. I think there were 5 different administrators. It's not a job you really want. It's not a real career builder. But John Pistol, who's the current administrator, used to be deputy director of the FBI, has done a good job. I think is good marks, nonpartisan. His term runs 5 years, so he's got about another 2 years, so that would carry him into a Romney administration if Romney were to win, or into a Obama administration. I hope that he will stay on into next year, even if the administration turns over. He is hoping we think, to be nominated to replace Director Mueller as head of the FBI next summer. So that'd be a nice transition, and TSA would then have to find another capable director. So with that, welcome the chance to hear my colleague and then maybe some questions, but good luck flying here in a couple days. Thanks.
Good afternoon. So I'll give you the very quick spiel on the ACLU, just in case any of you are not familiar with us. That's the American Civil Liberties Union. I am working for the American Civil Liberties Union of North Carolina, but we do have a national office as well as a Washington, D.C. office, and 51 affiliates across the country at this point. So we're sort of representative of the entire nation. And we're membership-based, so we have over 500,000 members across the country. Here in North Carolina, we have a little over 11,000 members. And we just have one mission, and that is to defend and protect the individual rights provided for in the U.S. Constitution, and here in North Carolina, the North Carolina Constitution as well. So that's the very quick spiel. So as was sort of mentioned, we did have objections about certain things that came up with the TSA, and I will say it's not like a blanket objection to the TSA or to security screenings, because everybody, I think, understands that we want to be safe when we're flying, especially after 9/11. So our objections were very specific, and as was mentioned, our first objection was actually to the terror watch list, and not the fact that they existed, but more the fact that they had become quite expansive, and were flagging people who are not actually terrorists, and there was no way for a person who was flagged, who was not really the person who should have been specified, to appeal or demonstrate in an accessible way, at least, that they were not this person, or that they were not a terrorist. There was not sort of an adequate process for appealing that list. That was an objection that actually, I think, I first started here in 2006. That was something that was pretty big in 2006. That was a big objection. I think it was a relatively newish process, and that was definitely a problem that we were seeing, and that problem actually, I think, has tapered off substantially. Starting around 2008, the newer objection, and the one that's sort of ongoing, was actually to the body scanners. Whole body imagers was what they were being called at the time, but everyone here probably knows them as body scanners. So this was a process that you essentially, I mean, if you've flown in the last 2 years, you've probably experienced it. You basically have to walk through this sort of little round room and it x-rays you, essentially. I could get more technological than that, not a lot more, but a little more if anyone was really interested. But essentially it just sort of scans you, and it uses a particular kind of technology, shortwave X-ray, and then the other one is the millimeter wave, I think is what it's called. So there's backscatter X-ray, and then there's this millimeter wave. So it can't see through you, but it can see under your clothing, and it will create an image of your body underneath your clothing that's supposed to detect anomalies on your body, particularly metal. And it's probably pretty much flawless at detecting metal on a person's body. So if you have a gun or a knife or something like that strapped to you, it will detect that for sure. So this type of technology was first, around 2008, they were starting to deploy it, and it was supposed to be a secondary screening process. So you go through that initial metal detector that, you know, if you've flown really at all ever in your life, you've probably gone through a metal detector. So you went through that, and then if there was some kind of alarm, or if, you know, you were on that terror watch list, or there was some other reason to put you through secondary screening, they would make you go through the body scanners. So most people hadn't really experienced it up until that period, because it was only if the first alarm went off would you go through this process. Around 2010, the TSA decided that they were going to implement body scanners as a primary screening method, which is why now any of us who have flown in the last couple of years have probably gone through it. It's not in every single airport. I should just qualify that. I think it's, they put airports in categories, and so they, I guess, probably the major travel areas were the top categories were the ones that were going to get body scanners. So for example, if you're flying out of Moline, Illinois, you're probably not going to go through a body scanner, and I know this because I did it last year, and I did not go through a body scanner. But here in Raleigh, you do. You go through a body scanner every time you fly. So that was, they were going to make that a primary screening process, and the reason was they wanted to detect non-metallic as well as metal devices that people might be carrying on to planes. So that's sort of the very short background that I'm sure we could get more into if people were interested, because we do have an expert here who could probably tell us about it. But the ACLU position on this, there were actually several privacy organizations that objected to the full body scanners. And it was based primarily on privacy concerns. So the ACLU actually initially started raising objections as early as 2006. The technology, I think, at that point was mostly in research mode. It wasn't really being deployed, but already people who were concerned about privacy were raising some objections. So the ACLU initially dubbed the body scanner technology a virtual strip search. And that was essentially that was our position. That was essentially what we believed this thing was. You're going to see a pretty graphic picture. At that time, it was a fairly graphic picture of a person's body. And so if you have any anomalies or perhaps medical equipment that you wouldn't want to have seen by everyone, or that might be embarrassing or humiliating, you know, the ACLU was very concerned as early as 2006 that that kind of thing would be visible to these TSA screeners. Things like a catheter, for example, would be visible potentially in these, as well as implants or prosthetics. So, you know, medical information was going to be displayed to what could arguably be called an untrained, in the medical field, TSA agent. And that would be perhaps humiliating or embarrassing. It could lead to additional pat-downs, and just, we were very concerned about the way that the images were going to be stored, used, whether they could ever be leaked, which some of them were, and I guess you'll perhaps be talking about that on Thursday. So there were a lot of concerns about it, and in 2008, when it really started to get pushed out, the ACLU was, along with one other organization that's called, it's the short for it is EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, I believe, and they actually litigated the issue. So we objected at the very beginning. Now, TSA did announce several privacy regulations to go along with the body scanners. They were going to blur faces. They had the machines modified so that they would not retain the images, or at least that's what they said. And the screeners were going to be segregated in a different room, but able to communicate with the TSA agent sort of on site where the scan was happening. So they could, you would walk through, and if you had something like a piece of metal, when I went through one time, I was wearing these earrings and forgot to take them out, so it, alerted, and they had to come and pat my ear, which was amusing, but there you go. So that it will sort of alert that something is wrong, and they'll say, okay, we'll check this area of the body, like check this person's knee, or, something's alerting on their stomach, pat them down, and so then you would get a pat down. So, but the actual person who's viewing the image would be in another room. So even with the so-called privacy protections the TSA initially announced, the ACLU warned that very often these types of protections fall away over time. So you might have them in place now, but that doesn't mean that you're always going to disable the retention of the images. It doesn't mean you're always going to have your person viewing the image segregated from the person actually doing the screening. And very often that is what happens. So the suggestion was, if we looked at this is sort of the technological version of essentially having a passenger walk through a room with a bag over their head completely naked. And if this were what we were actually asking people to do, of course Americans wouldn't stand for it. We would object to that. So our argument was, if you wouldn't ask people to do it in person, why are you asking people to do it through this technological version? And our warnings that the body scanners were the worst kind of slippery slope actually started to come true, because as I mentioned, in 2008, it was going to be a secondary screening method. And that was the way it was announced, and that was going to be one of the protections that were in place against sort of the abuse of the technology, I suppose you could say. And by 2010, they became a primary screening method. So very quickly, you start to see that it could, in fact, be a slippery slope, and that's sort of why it's good, I think, as was said, that we continue to put the pressure on and be vigilant about how the TSA is operating and what kinds of technology is being used, not just by the TSA, but frankly by the entire government. So the body scanners were introduced as this secondary screening, which I already sort of explained, and within 2 years the TSA announced that the body scanners would be used at the majority of airports, let's say. So in 2011, the ACLU there was some new software that was introduced to go with the body scanners that was going to make the images less graphic. And I have a very small picture of it, so I can't really share it with you, but it's essentially like a chalk outline of the body is what they now see. It's not this very graphic image that we saw when the body scanners first came out. And a little piece of the body would be sort of highlighted with a box, like a little yellow box over your knee or your elbow or whatever. In my case, over my ear, for example. So you would see this chalk outline with the little box, and that would indicate that that's an anomaly and that the area should be investigated further. So the ACLU at that point did acknowledge that the new software represented a significant improvement for privacy, but there were still concerns that remained. And those concerns were, for one thing, what was happening with the original image, because the software was having to translate that original image, a very graphic image, into this chalk outline that the screener could actually see. And so we were curious as to what was happening with the original image and whether that was still being produced somewhere and someone was still looking at it, or whether it was being saved or retained anywhere. And we were also concerned because the system identifies only anomalies, which means that, again, you're not going to have a discerning human eye looking at something, which is not we're not actually arguing for a discerning human eye looking at everything, but you're not going to have a discerning human eye. You're having software that's translating something. So if you have, I said earlier, like a catheter or some prosthetic or something like that, it's going to identify an anomaly, potentially even just, genetic or human sort of bulges, let's just say, could be identified as an anomaly, and it would lead to a pat down. So we did get a little concerned that more of these aggressive kind of pat downs by TSA were going to happen because of the switchover in software, but we did think that it was a less invasive system. And so we were happy to see that there was an improvement in the software. And I think that one of the things that we acknowledged is that it was the pressure of organizations like EPIC and the ACLU that caused the TSA to, or that at least put pressure on the TSA to try and make these kinds of changes, to try and be respectful of Americans' privacy as they're going through these scanners. So we do believe that continuing to put on this kind of pressure is something that will definitely continue to have an impact as the TSA and other government programs go forward. I'm going to talk really, really briefly about the law. I'm happy to take a little more, to take some questions about it, but y'all are law students, so I thought I'd just mention that, of course, when we're talking about privacy issues, we're talking really about the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is the right of the people to be secure in their persons, their houses, papers, and effects from unreasonable government searches without a warrant. There's a little more to it, but that's about it. And so airport searches are generally considered to be administrative searches. And so they are subject to the Fourth Amendment, but they're not unreasonable. They are searches, and everybody agrees that they're subject to some Fourth Amendment sort of analysis. But the courts have been very deferential to the TSA and to, prior to the TSA, to other searching being done at the airport. Since about the early 70s, I think it was, there's been some case law in place. I don't know that it's ever gotten to the Supreme Court, but the circuits have pretty much all said, when the cases have come up, that these are administrative searches, and so as long as they're following their own procedures or statutory authorization, they are free to search passengers, every single passenger that goes through. There doesn't have to be any kind of individualized suspicion. More recently, the Ninth Circuit and others have said there doesn't have to even be consent. Back in the 70s, there was some argument about whether you might need consent from the passenger, and whether that was sort of deemed an implied consent, or just trying to get to the plane was your consent to the search. One way or the other, there might have been a requirement for consent. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Basically, trying to get into the secured area behind security, that's enough for you to be subject to the search. So there's not really a question about whether or not passengers can be searched. And frankly, there's not even much of a question about how they can be searched. I think at a certain point, as members of the general public, we would kind of draw the line. As was again mentioned, at a certain point, people are just going to stop traveling, and then you're going to have a real problem. So you're going to have airlines and all kinds of people getting upset about that. So there's definitely, I think, authorization for searches. And in the one case in which this was litigated, again, it was EPIC that brought this lawsuit. They actually lost on Fourth Amendment grounds. They did get kind of a minor win from the DC Circuit Court, which told the TSA that they should have gone through the proper administrative rulemaking process in order to introduce the body scanners the way that they did. And I think the latest on that is that TSA has said that they will go through the rulemaking process in 2014. Or 2013, somewhere around there. Several years late is the point. So that was obviously problematic. I think another one of the arguments that's been used against the body scanners is that they may not be as effective as people think that they are. So there are two reasons why that's problematic. One is it does certainly lull people into a false sense of security. And I think people, the reason why the so-called underwear bomber was stopped was actually passengers noticed something amiss and reported it. And so there's been arguments that the body scanners might have picked up on the fact that he had concealed explosives in his underwear, but that's not necessarily true because the body scanners don't pick up things that are very thin and close to the body, molded to the body. They're picking up on density differences. So if something has approximately the same density as skin, the scanners aren't necessarily going to pick it up. They might, but they might not. They're definitely going to pick up metal. And one of the things that was observed is that, these metal detectors also pick up the metal. The problem was the reason why things were getting through security is because people who were working as agents and doing the secondary pat down after the, X-ray, the metal detector went off, they didn't want to grope passengers. They didn't want to get so invasive or look into places where certain things might be concealed. And so they weren't catching all of the time the metal that was going through. You can understand that sort of human disinclination to really be aggressive when you're patting people down. But because of that, there are certain reports that say that that's why metal was getting through, even the metal detectors, and that's why the body scanners might be an improvement, but they could then be used as a secondary screening. You could put a person through metal detector, which is actually what currently happens in a lot of places. Here in Raleigh, you go through a metal detector first and then through the body scanner. So you could go through the metal detector, and if it alarmed, then go through the body scanner, and that would be a secondary screening, and it might be a good way to sort of resolve the problems that people are having with the body scanners and the privacy issues. But as I say, TSA is responding to some degree to complaints about the body scanners. So I'm going to stop there. See if there are questions.
We can open up to questions. I have one real quick. Sorry, Ian. You mentioned that this idea that the general public will draw a boundary and at some point stop traveling. And I'm wondering how much of an actual check you really think that is, especially in today's world where travel is so important and we are all so interconnected. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we have speakers coming from Washington, D.C. to Duke Law a couple of times a week. How reasonable is it to expect that people would actually stop traveling because they feel their privacy is being violated?
I don't know that people will I think there will be some people who are going to continue to travel, but I think there are, as I think it was mentioned that there are less people traveling even now based on these restrictions because it's kind of a hassle. And I actually know some people who basically stopped flying. And I've never really delved too deep into why they stopped flying, but I think if you have a critical mass of people who just stop flying, then you're going to have the airlines up in arms over it. So it may or may not be the actual individuals just completely stop flying. It might be that the airlines are like, we have to come up with a better solution because we're losing an awful lot of business over this. So it's probably not the best check. I think being vigilant and supporting organizations like the ACLU and EPIC in their attempts, like the ACLU collected 1,000 complaints when the body scanners came online. We got 1,000 complaints. We have a project that we call Safe and Free, where we try to challenge this idea that you can't have a free society that is not completely surveilled by the government without giving up safety. And we're trying to challenge that idea because we do think there are ways that you can balance these two interests. So I think sort of supporting, collection of stories and that kind of thing does put some pressure on, and can keep being kind of vigilant about what's going on.
Yeah, what we've seen is not so much that some people are worried about privacy, of course, but many more people worry about the wait times. And so if you look at kind of traffic since 9/11, it went down, of course, and it's rebounded. It went down in 2008 and then it's rebounded since the economics. But what has happened is that short haul traffic, less than 500-mile flights have gone down and stayed down because people, when they make the time benefit analysis, they're like, look, if it's going to take me an hour and a half to get through, I can drive, so we'll just do that. So that's where we've seen the biggest impact is those short haul flights.
Yeah.
Okay, so kind of central to the TSA approach is this very technology-oriented, procedure-oriented thing that we put passengers through. In a way that people do it elsewhere in the world, I think maybe most notably at Ben Gurion in Tel Aviv, is they have a security system that's really focused on the human element. And so they have professionally trained profilers who are uniformed, undercover, whatever, operating in the airport. They question people, they perform background checks, and it's extremely effective. Despite the political climate in Israel, there's no terrorist activity that comes out of there, more or less. So I guess my question is, for you, did the TSA debate these things as they were implementing them? And then for you, how much more or less does the ACLU hate that approach?
Well, I think we hear this a lot, because a lot of Republicans in particular are, why can't we do it like Israel? They're so great, The problem, the problem is they have one airport and I'm making this up, but 4 million flights or 4 million flyers a year or something like that. The U.S. I think is about over close to 2 million travelers a day. And 440 odd airports. So, the average time with a screener in Israel, I think, is something like over 10 minutes. Whereas in the U.S., the extra time you're with the screener is, whatever it averages out to, 1 or less. So, if you want to have waits out the door, probably at RDU, you'd probably be stretching to about here. You could probably try that approach. It's just not going to work. And I didn't get a chance to mention this before, but just the budget situation that's going on in Washington, which you can't really avoid. TSA is going to take their share of the hit here. If the sequester goes through at the end of the year, they're looking at a 10% cut That'll be layoffs. That'll be, delays in equipment, and those kinds of things. So, that could be handled by increasing the ticket taxes you pay, which you only pay part of covering the cost of that right now. But that would be a big blow for TSA and probably would lead to wait times going up considerably. Again, getting the PreCheck while you still can.
How much more or less do we hate that? I think, it's kind of like, I think you mentioned the SPOT program,
Yeah.
this idea of sort of identifying what a profile might be of a person who could be a terrorist. And the only times when we object to that kind of thing is when they're based on things like race, national origin, religion, those kinds of things. So, I mean, we wouldn't necessarily just facially object to that kind of system. I think we would object to it if we saw it being implemented in a way where it was based, primarily, actually, and after 9/11, this was an objection that came up, was that, like, Muslim men were being profiled at airports. And so we did have some objections. You can't just categorize all Muslim men as terrorists. You need to actually have a little more detail to what you're doing. And that would be, I think, the only time when we would object to that kind of system.
And there has been, unfortunately, there's a negative piece in Boston on the SPOT program recently where some officers, whistleblower types, said they were told essentially they have quotas on how many people they flagged for suspicious behavior.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's good to keep an eye on these folks.
Will you comment, either or both of you, just on the defense contractor aspect of this? How much the body scanners cost, how much money the defense contractors are making, and what role they had in lobbying for the body scanners?
Sure. And we actually represent one of them, so sure they would love to hear that. I'd say for most of the companies that are involved in the TSA business, it's a tiny little slice of their work compared to what they spend on defense work typically, but is meaningful. So, for instance, there's this thing, the big money that came for the body scanners was after the underwear bomber. It was happened to be right at the end of the year, it was right around Christmas, right? Mm-hmm. Christmas Eve or something. And literally, Congress at that minute decided to hand TSA an extra $1 billion overnight to buy these machines and rush them out there. And that was why they got escalated so quickly. That wouldn't happen now because of the budget situation. But so, I mean, they're expensive machines. They are expensive to develop. They're expensive to buy. They are a small chunk of TSA's budget, and that's why they're still only out at certain airports and certain lanes because they haven't been able to get the funding to put them kind of everywhere. But these devices are over several $100,000 a piece. They require sophisticated refreshing of technology. They get a update pretty often as to the threat profiles of which actual chemicals they're looking for in combinations. One of the client we represent makes these up in just north of Baltimore. It's a pretty interesting place to watch. So again, I wouldn't say the companies that make these are doing much better overseas because their airports are being more aggressive than we are on what they should do. The big thing with the underwear bomber was that where I think he took off in the Netherlands, they just missed it. And so that's why our government is running around. Secretary Napolitano has been lobbying all these other governments to put these machines in at their airports. So before people get on planes coming here, they have to go through these things. We can't make them do it, but we can kind of suggest it. And that's what she's been doing.
Now, I don't know the exact numbers, but it is a pretty expensive endeavor to try and put them in everywhere. I think what I would say is that the suggestion that's been made by security and technology experts that work for like our national office is that there might have been better ways to invest that money in other ways to prevent terrorists from boarding planes. But I think the biggest thing that I noticed in actually researching to come here today, because this is not sort of my primary area of expertise, it's really more our national office that works on this, is that the biggest defenders of the scanners tend to be the people who manufacture them. They're the ones who say they don't just detect metal, they detect like all this other stuff. And it's also on occasion, I'm sure this isn't the case here, but it's also occasionally their biggest defenders are people who represent their companies. And so you'll see sometimes a footnote on these articles where they'll say, by the by, this person represents, whatever company that manufactures these scanners.
I have written those footnotes.
So, it is just sort of interesting that they are certainly trying to sell their product. There's no question about that.
question about the idea of PreCheck versus these separate airline lines for frequent flyers and first-class passengers and everything. You seem to be very critical of those, but at the same time, PreCheck seems to offer a similar experience for a price, either for frequent flyers or for people willing to go through this process and pay money.
Well, the big difference is that in PreCheck, there's some type of risk management. You either have gone through an interview with customs, you've been fingerprinted, they look at those lists every day to make sure that you haven't shown up on some kind of watch list or something else, and they've decided that based on their review of you, you are lower risk, and in most cases, very low risk. Whereas the fact you bought a first class ticket says nothing. It says you have a lot of money. In fact, it might make you more risky. And so I think there's a big difference between saying you're in this line that's going to have faster screening. We're going to dedicate more resources to you because you paid a lot of money, either on a particular ticket or because you're a very good customer of American Airlines, as opposed to you've gone through an interview and the government has decided you're low risk. And so in some airports, there's room for both of these. If you're Atlanta or somewhere like that, there's room to have different models. At a smaller airport, there's not. There's probably only room for kind of 2 lanes or 2 lines. And so you're essentially saying we don't have room for the lower risk line because we've got to deal with the first class line. That's my objection to it. The airlines are profiting off of this inefficiency in the system. You'll notice we don't represent airlines.
So I believe you're allowed to opt out of the body scanner, I guess in lieu of a pat down. And so how much safer are we if people can get pat downs?
Again, the threat is continually changing, and I think you have to kind of prepare for 2 sets of terrorists. There's some that are really good, and there's some that are stupid. And so not every. I mean, the theory is, well, if you haven't figured out the foolproof machine, then you're not going to find the best, the most clever terrorist, and that's maybe true. But not everyone's that clever. Look at Richard Reed. Look at the underwear bomber. Look at some of these idiots, who got caught by turning in their rental truck. These kinds of things. So, there's a layered system. Sometimes the media likes to kind of portray it as, well, if this machine doesn't work 100% of the time and find every last thing, then we're kind of screwed. There's a layered system. So, I mean, that's why you have armed cockpit doors, you have armed pilots, you have flight attendant training. You have all these different layers. Now, one could argue that, for instance, like the Air Marshal program, I think, was set up right after 9/11, or expanded quite a bit after 9/11 as kind of a last ditch, kind of the only thing we have while we're building all these other things. I think most people think that the Air Marshal program can be scaled back considerably, and that thing's expensive to fly all these people around who are trained law enforcement. That money could, I think, in most cases, could be spent better off elsewhere. I think that the pat down is you're going to find a lot of things with a pat down. They're just very time consuming, and they really give TSA a bad image. I think that's something that Mr. Pistol has particularly recognized, that having your agency be on Saturday Night Live and these kind of Jay Leno, it doesn't inspire confidence. It makes people not want to help you, not want to be cooperative. And the thing that causes them the most trouble are people that come and complain and kind of gin up the lines and cause a scene. That creates a huge ripple effect downstream for them. So that he's tried to kind of, let's have a calmer checkpoint, let's have options, let's make people think that we have options for them, the PreCheck program in particular, and give people a sense of confidence in what's going on. I love you.
So I think most people would recognize an emotional difference between an electronic image of themselves and actually going through the process of getting naked in front of a TSA agent or being seen naked. And so is there any discussions at the ACLU in our post 9/11 world where security is a problem and there will be a lot of government actions in the future trying to address security and privacy, sort of saving credibility by being more selective in terms of what you complain about instead of sort of having a across the board?
I've heard that other times. One of the issues, the reason why I'm probably here on this issue, even though, as I said, it's not my area of expertise, is because one of the things that we fought really hard over the last 4 years here in North Carolina was an attempt to start taking DNA on arrest without a warrant, which actually did pass, but that's a whole nother panel. So I have spent a lot of time looking at Fourth Amendment laws, where I'm going with that. And I heard when I was working on that same sort of argument, well, aren't you sort of arguing too soon? It's when they start trying to take DNA from every person off the street that you guys should get up in arms. This isn't where you draw the line. And I think our argument is, and I sort of talked about it a little bit by saying, when we're vigilant and we put pressure on these agencies, it forces them to respond to us to some degree. And so I think not taking a principled stand and not saying like, no, this is intrusive and it violates or at least puts in jeopardy something that we as Americans hold very dear and was a fundamental principle of our founding. If we don't sort of push back, then that leaves them free to just keep going forward all the time. So we always, even with the little things, even with things where maybe the general public isn't always on our side, we will always take a stand because we know that if we let the little things slide, then the bigger things are coming.
It was interesting. I was on a panel on this issue up in D.C. with a guy named Chris Calabrese, who works in the ACLU D.C. office, and somebody asked him a similar kind of question, and he basically, I think his line was, look, we're not in the solutions business. It's not ACLU's job to say that I like that program. They're essentially supposed to be critics, and I'm okay with that. That's like they're not running TSA. So it has been interesting though, because there have been a growth of these kind of privacy officers at most departments. TSA has one, Homeland Security has one, the FBI has one, and they typically draw people out of some kind of civil libertarian background, legal profession or something like that. And it's interesting to see how those people morph from critic to having to play in the game. How do they participate in these kinds of things? I was on the President Bush's Civil Liberties Board, and it was interesting trying to figure out, where do you kind of put your effort on liberties issues? It's tricky. Well, one thing I know we didn't talk about here, but is an issue that's coming down the pike pretty quickly, is the Real ID issue, which was a federal standard on driver's licenses, which has been delayed and delayed and delayed. But the deadline is now coming up for January of next year, and there's nothing DHS can do to delay it anymore. And so states that are not in compliance, and that's about 20 of them, allegedly, you would not be able to use a license to fly. Now, they can let you fly anyway. They can do some kind of enhanced screening or something like that. But it's been a very interesting dilemma because, again, left-right continuum. Right conservative governors don't like it. Liberal groups don't like it. And so a lot of states have objected. But it's kind of like, look, if you're not going to build an ID with some credibility, then that means TSA can't rely on that ID. And so that's where you end up with these kind of additional steps to determine ID, secure flight, and these kinds of things. So it's, we have a crappy history with identity management in this country for a long, long time because we're decentralized. And that's why you end up with some of these other programs that are kind of workarounds.
When you were talking about deciding how much to scale the program on or back, the countervailing concerns I heard against security were typically economics and budgetary constraints. Are there other concerns that you use to decide when to implement something like the body scanner?
I'd say, TSA's their first rule, and it's just kind of life, is it doable? Can the airlines and airports do something? And we have 430 odd airports. They're of wildly different quality. Some are new, some are old. You got all these different airlines with old IT systems. It's a kind of, they're stuck with dealing with a infrastructure that's very unusual. Most countries have essentially their version of TSA, but it's essentially a regulatory body like the FDA or something like that. But then the airports or the airlines provide this actual security. And that's the way we had it before 9/11. We now have a system where you've got both TSA, both a regulator and a operator. Some people think that's not a good idea because essentially they're always kind of inclined to pat themselves on the back. Hey, we're doing a great job. Until GAO says they're not, or Brian Ross on ABC News or something. And that's, I think, big dilemma. It's kind of like who's judging them? How do they get judged? But their typical rule is kind of, can airlines do something? Are the funds there for something? Is it going to make sense? Is it doable? And the way the budget is now, you're not going to see much new of anything. They'll be lucky if they can pay to refresh the equipment that's going bad. All the stuff that was bought after 9/11 is getting old and breaking down, and they've got to figure out what to do about that.
So is there any thought on the government side of how this impacts privacy, or are they relying on the case law to say we can do whatever kind of search we want? And if it is unconstitutional, a group like the ACLU will bring it up and stop it. We don't really have to worry about it.
I mean, I'd say, I think the law is pretty clear. They can get away with pretty much everything they want, and they've even kind of, unlike other parts of Homeland Security, have really not done typical rulemakings on most programs. They have issued them as security directives so that they don't go through regular, kind of Federal Register type of situation. There's been some push to move that in a regular manner, but what happens is now we've had 5 different regimes at TSA through now, 8 years of George Bush and almost 8 years of Obama, and the professional security people kind of all have the same view, like talk as little as possible, explain as little as possible, and when people complain, we'll see you in court.
Last question. All right, join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you all for coming.